Our next speaker is K.Burbaitė, who comes from the Lithuanian Military Medical Service. She is not only a psychologist, but also a captain. She is in Jonas Basanavičius Military Medical Service, and she will share her ideas about the psychological help at the army. Kristina, please join and share your experience. Hello. Thank you for your presentation. I would like to share the experience of my experience and my colleagues' experience of working at the military service when we speak about the provision of psychological help and help in suicidal cases, and what challenges do soldiers encounter in the army in terms of psychological help. The major part of psychological help receivers are men, because 19% of the Lithuanian army are a male population. Work at the military medical service is particular. It conducts a few functions. For instance, we evaluate their physical and mental health, whether they are proper, adequate for military service. Here, we have a few dilemmas arising. A soldier is considered as fit for service when they are healthy. And speaking about mental health, this boundary between health illness is not as clear as it might be in medicine when we are speaking about physical health. Some individuals who want to serve in the army tend to conceal their physical drawbacks. Certain individuals, like conscripts, might try avoid military service, and then they aggravate their conditions. So one of the functions that we carry out at medical service is separating them. Certain psychologists evaluate the eligibility of the individuals, and others work in military units and consult soldiers, consult officers, provide help, carry out various evaluations. One of the important elements when providing the service is defining confidentiality boundaries. This is a very relevant question and very often arises during classes and seminars, because soldiers have concerns whether they have a certain disturbance and whether this will not be passed on to the to their superiors. So we are very open that when we are speaking about suicidal risks, then confidentiality does not apply. We psychologists carry out suicide prevention, intervention, and postvention. And this happens very widely. All the soldiers on a 5-year basis have to get the first aid course, and suicide prevention classes are also included there. We also conduct these classes if the commander of the unit expresses such a need. Then there is a decision of the highest military officials that at least once a year there should be suicide prevention classes, and psychological training should be conducted at least once every quarter. Many soldiers can provide primary psychological help, but many get the message that we have to react when we encounter certain suicidal signs. And sometimes this leads to paradoxical situations. When a soldier says a joke to a colleague on the topic of suicides, then he ends up at a psychologist's office. For instance, there was a case when a soldier was very ill, had fever, and he said to the medical personnel that I had better die. And then a psychologist was called to evaluate the suicide risk, because in that situation there was none. Commanders speak more and more about psychological help, about the reduction of the stigma to seek help, and many conscripts are reminded of a possibility to receive psychological help. When shooting exercises take place, all psychologists ask soldiers whether they feel well. The suicide subject is very well known in the military. During the preventive training, not all the soldiers had turned out to have heard about a big difference between men and women. And after that, in terms of suicide, and after that, discussions arise and considerations why this happens and why this impacts men's psychological health. Then we also get various defensive reactions. The soldiers say that nobody will speak about suicide in the army. But then after such training, we get questions, do we really get people seeking our help when they feel suicidal? But very often we hear soldiers sharing their personal experiences when their kin were suicidal, or there are also soldiers who had suicidal thoughts or crises or attempts. And this is very effective. This is a message that these people are no different. And there are people around us who may be thinking about suicide. It is also not easy to speak with the soldiers about suicide, bearing in mind that military service itself means that a soldier has to be ready to sacrifice their lives in the case of the military threat. And when we speak about suicide, they ask us whether this is related to courage. For instance, if we refer to Kalantas emoliation.
Kalbant apie profesinės karo tarnybos karius.
Now, regarding professional military service, they also encounter professional challenges, and more often do the soldiers seek help. But they don't want to be seen that they are seeking help with a psychologist. And we are trying to be flexible. And in the post-COVID situation, we now have remote consulting, which the soldiers do use. Because actually it is quite challenging to organize regular consultations because they have training, they have extraordinary activities and so on. Another issue is that in a crisis situation, especially if it is related to inappropriate behavior like intoxicating materials or violence or other offenses, then soldiers feel ashamed and fear to speak about that, and this stops them from seeking help. Another thing which really helps is cooperating with their commanders, speaking about crisis, about about the fact that any of us can get into a crisis situation, and psychological help would be offered proactively. And very often, that peer soldiers refer soldiers to psychologists when they experience some difficult situations like losses or traumas. Sometimes this help to a soldier is useful if it is related to disciplinary violations and when they are seeking help to solve the problems. Oftentimes, self-identification with the military structure helps the soldier to reduce the stigma when seeking help. And during consultations, if soldiers say that if the commander thinks that I need psychological help, that means that I do. And we have had very sensitive reactions when a soldier is referred for a consultation and the soldier gets touched about their commanders caring about their lives, which means that such cooperation with the commanders very serves it well, and timely help, which helps prevent more difficult crisis situations, actually helps prevent some more dangerous situations. Now, regarding conscripts, again, there are many challenges which we encounter when providing psychological help to them. And again, psychologists act proactively here. When conscripts start their military service, during the first time, during the first month, the psychologist introduces himself to the unit and presents mental health opportunities and responds to the questions which may be related to the difficulties in military service. They may indicate subjective actions which may impede certain activities, and the response to the questions about the motivation to serve in the military, about the substances affecting psychiatric mental health, and about suicidal thoughts. And everybody views that favorably. The psychologist invites them for a primary conversation, and in case of need, they provide help and evaluate risks. Of course, the unit psychologist gets an additional burden, and there's no specific time allocated for psychological help, which means that soldier cannot conduct military activities. But it serves well because we see that we can prevent certain suicides. And we have shown that we have identified that a soldier may attempt suicide after his health was tested. Or it may happen that before they start the military service or towards the end of the military service, somebody they lose their kin, for instance, and the family and their family member. And because during the military service they have limited contacts with their family, this becomes very traumatic for them. And also, all these experiences may become the reason for their suicidal behavior. One of the challenges that a psychologist encounters is the provision of psychological help when a soldier is not motivated for military service. And certain soldiers tend to manipulate in the suicidal context. And it happens that when coming to a psychologist, they are very open about willing to leave the military service, and I will mutilate myself or do something to myself. This is a suicidal threat and a challenge to evaluate the risk. Because there are cases when a soldier would say a few suicidal attempts in the past and is telling us about their plans to commit suicide now. And then they are referred to psychiatric, to mental health. But then the doctor, the therapist, the clinicist receives certain threats from the soldier for having done that. On the other hand, providing help to soldiers, especially conflicts related to suicidal risk, is really a useful tool. One of the examples could be a soldier addressing a psychologist. At first, he was not speaking about suicides. It was only about tense relationship. And during the course of consultation, he suddenly started having suicidal thoughts and used to draw the topics of death. But he had no suicidal attempts and his risk was low. He received regular consultations, and during one of the consultations, the soldier said that he scratched his hand with a knife, although the scars were not visible, and it is not yet clear whether this self-mutilation, self-injury happened. But he was very cooperative. And we returned to the question of confidentiality boundaries because this was related to self-injury. In such cases, conscripts are not referred to a mental health hospital, but having evaluated this in this case, bearing in mind that it was the end of the service and in cooperation with the commanders, the soldier was not referred to the mental health hospital. It was agreed that the commanders will be informed that he tends to injure himself. And the safety plan provided that he should give away his knife to the unit commander. So he was very cooperative, and we continued the consultations, and we managed to maintain the risk. The soldier was able to finish his service, and the risk dropped. During the next consultation, he felt ashamed for receiving additional attention from his commanders. But we have such a context. We do speak a lot about confidentiality, boundaries, and sometimes we need to step them over. In order to protect the soldier, especially when they have access to guns. And we know that soldiers experience lots of stress. It may be due to young age or due to psychological maturity, which does not always reach 18 years of age. And sometimes suicidal thoughts are a type of reaction to a huge stress. When we are speaking to the soldiers, they speak about suicide, but in fact, they don't want to be in the service. It's too difficult for them, and this is their reaction towards stress. Normally, if a soldier had certain difficulties, for instance, they grew up in families which had certain addictions, or had felt psychological neglect, their adaptation is much more difficult. And if soldiers come from families where there are always conflicts and people are shouting, they are very sensitive towards the raised voice of the commander. And it's not easy to discuss that. And it's not easy to determine whether the soldier wants to cooperate or not. And therefore, we need to speak to commanders. Now, regarding the results of mentioned by Agle, it may be that the attitude towards such help are inherited. For instance, if soldiers come from rural areas, they often say that there was no psychological help around them, or it was ineffective, or they were bullied at school, or there were addictions or violence in their families. And very often they state that this was happening, but nobody gave them any help. Nobody knew about that. And they are as if disappointed. They cannot expect to receive any effective help. Sometimes when they encounter a psychologist in the army, this is the first time they meet someone like that. Also, one of the challenges and one of the reasons when speaking about conscripts is the peculiarities of military service, because it's very difficult to ensure the anonymity of a conscript when they seek help with a psychologist. Without the knowledge of the commander or responsible personnel, conscripts cannot be walking around in the unit. There's lots of control. And when willing to receive psychological help, they either have to tell their commander or address the medical staff for a referral. to a psychologist. And it's not easy because you have to tell someone that you want to receive psychological consultation. Sometimes the soldiers try not to disclose that. They just go to the medical service. But we have to determine whether the soldier is not manipulating, whether they will be able to participate in military training. We try to ensure this doesn't happen. One of the ways is one of the ways to seek anonymously psychological help is the anonymous psychological help service, which works all the clock round. But here we encounter the challenges of military service because conscripts may use phones, may receive their phones only during their leisure time for a very short time. Therefore, it's not easy for them to call the helpline. Of course, we cooperate with the commanders and ask them to provide them with the possibility to call in private, or they may make calls when they are on a leave at home. And this is related to AGLE's results. Actually, conscripts encounter the psychologist for a brief time, and when they serve for a longer term, they already have a contact with the psychologist and they trust the psychologist. And of course, it is also related to the motivation to serve this, to do military service. If they are not motivated, there are many aspects related to military service, and they will evaluate that negatively because they are not willing to be in the service.
In conclusion, we have quite a number of challenges in the population of soldiers, and they have access to potential suicide tools like guns, which is a risk factor. So if we conclude, it's very important to reduce the stigma of seeking psychological help, the proactive work of psychologists, and cooperation with the commanders and the medical staff. That would be all. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Christina, for a very interesting presentation. We have loads of questions. They are quite similar. I will try to read some of them. A very important question. Everybody has heard about the bullying and the old Dedovshchina in the Soviet army. What could you say about the bullying in our army, the Lithuanian army? Is it a problem? Do we work with it? Do you work with it? Yes, we do work with the problem of bullying. We do preventional work. We try to inform and the soldiers. I don't want to say that there's no bullying at all because the army is a huge organization. There are many people, but we do have means of managing the possible risks. Every commander has his or her commander to whom he or her might contact in case of difficult problems. So we do have means of managing bullying risks. Sometimes there are some bullying cases among soldiers, but in general, we do have means for fighting this problem. What can do the commanders? What is recommended? This additional physical activity, additional tasks. They can punish soldiers, but it cannot be bullying. I have been reading on this earlier. You will correct me if I'm wrong, but this cannot be compared. The situation in our Lithuanian army and the situation in the Soviet army, these are two things that could not be even compared. We do not have any such big phenomena of bullying in our army. It's a different world. Yes, the soldiers who are serving for a longer time, they see the differences in the case of bullying, in the case of alcohol use. It's like day and night, black and white, and we do react. Sure, there are some situations, but even the commanders would face some consequences if bullying would be not addressed. Yes. We have a very large group of conscripts. CASPs. Can they seek psychological help? Yes, they can seek psychological help. They can inform the commander that they need it. Do they seek help? Less. I would say from my practice that they seek for help less, but in general, yes. Thank you, Kristina, for your presentation and for the answers.